wonderful to see everybody in person. And I actually think this is a meeting that genuinely needs to happen. And we need to make sure that as we recover, we level up. And I actually think that we have a huge opportunity to do that.
The G7 represents not only many of Canada's strongest allies, but our closest friends.
Everyone at the table understood and understands both the seriousness and the challenges that we are up against, and the responsibility of our proud democracies to step up and deliver for the rest of the world.
A very warm welcome. You're watching a special show, Global Chit-chat, where we discuss the relevant and recent international issues. And today we are going to discuss one such issue. We're joined by our foreign policy expert, Mr. Tridivesh Singh Maini. Thanks a lot for joining us, sir.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So, sir, as we know that the G7 meet took place over the weekend, and it was for the first time in such a long time since COVID hit us that the world leaders met in person. So what do you think is the real significance of this meet, as it was said that the US is back on top? So what does it really mean for the Joe Biden administration?
It's a cocktail of many things. So one is the symbolic part, as you very rightly pointed out. You know, in the aftermath of the pandemic, it's the first time, the G7 has met. I mean, had a physical meeting basically, right? So that sends out, probably the message being sent out is that gradually, the Western democracies and other members of the G7, like Japan and all, they want to get back to gradually, slowly but surely, they're moving back to normal. So there is a symbolic message in that. The other symbolic message is obviously it's the first time the G7 has met under a new US President, Joe Biden. So I think that's a very important part, because if you look at it, the thrust essentially, basically Biden has carried forward what he's been saying earlier also about America is back, as you rightly pointed out, and along with other Western democracies, that the US wants to basically play a role on important global issues and not leave even developing countries to their own. So, for instance, the first thing is if you look at the issue of climate change. In recent months, the US has been taking the lead, but now you have the US and other members of the G7 speaking about how they want to assist the developing countries to reduce the dependence upon coal, to reduce carbon emissions, and taking a lead basically. So that's an important part, because what you had in recent years was obviously the Trump administration also did make references to how it was essential for liberal democracies, Western democracies to get together, and how this was an alternative narrative to that of China's. But as we've been discussing earlier also, by the US being isolationist, nothing was being achieved in that sense. Even Biden, as you have said earlier, has had constraints, but I think some positive signals have been sent out. And if you break it down, also, his meetings with the other members of the G7, leaders of G7 countries, some of whom Trump had, personally didn't really get along well with. You don't see that in the case of Biden, and so these are all important developments, because at the end of the day, if you have to, if there is all this talk about China providing one model, to have an alternative, you need to have countries. You need to have US, UK, and other important countries working together towards an alternative, and also to take the lead role on important issues, like you said, for instance, whether it's climate change and numerous other issues.
So as we know, the entire world is still reeling under the coronavirus pandemic. The horror is still not over. Of course, the cases are coming down across the world, but yet we are still afraid. So how important do you think the meet was when it comes to creating a strategy to end the coronavirus pandemic, and also how the world leaders pledged that 1 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccine would be provided to the low-income countries?
As we said earlier, there was no collective approach. Countries like Australia, Japan, other members of the G7, and even within other members of other EU member states. They wanted to have a collective, they wanted to work with the US, but the US was not really providing a leadership role. There was, of course, talk about, this thing of shifting the supply chains, working on that together. But in terms of dealing with the pandemic, there was no comprehensive strategy. So now I think the first part about the most important part is obviously about G7 countries working together and committing 1 billion vaccines. That will not be enough, of course, and criticism has come from the WHO, from United Nations, that this is not enough. But I think the message was also, this was a message to China, because China has been saying that the Western democracies. So now the fine print of this, it remains to be seen that how quick this is in terms of, because as you have at the beginning of the show, you very rightly said that even though cases have gone down. I mean, there's no room for complacency at all. And there's already talk about, the third wave and so on and so forth. I mean, if you look at India itself, other developing countries also, where the rate of vaccination is not that fast, they don't have time they don't have that much of time. So this has to be delivered, the delivery has to be quick, and even the scale has to be larger. Yeah, this is not enough. And I think one more point which I would also like to make is that what we have been noticing is that in a number of Western countries, not just the US, even France and all, there has been wastage of vaccines. So there has been a number of people have also criticized countries like US and France that why don't they share more of the vaccines which are being wasted, because every few days you see instances of vaccines being wasted in the US, wasted in France. So that is something where I think the Western democracies, members of G7, I think they need to deliver more on that. Some concessions have been made, as we earlier also discussed, about the waiver on intellectual property rights regarding, the manufacture of vaccines. But this all is theoretically, this is good. It's reassuring, but a lot will depend upon the fine print. A lot will depend upon the implementation. A lot will also depend upon the trajectory of the pandemic in these countries, because we've noticed that once, whether it's the US, whether it's UK, the focus is always, obviously the first focus, the thrust will be on dealing with the pandemic domestically, and then they can help out, the developing world and so on.
Well, of course, rightly said, there's an abundance of vaccines in the Western world, and there are less number of people that actually are to be inoculated, and many people are also skeptical about getting vaccinated, and therefore that has led to a lot of wastage of those vaccines. That is true. So moving on to a very important topic, that is B3W, that was discussed and that has gained significance after this meet. So according to you, what is the real significance of this? How will this benefit India, and what are the challenges that one could face?
Okay. So the first point is that, again, the Trump administration also, under the umbrella of the Indo-Pacific, had spoken about connectivity initiatives. The budget was not very high. So in terms of resources, one major criticism was that, this is not enough. So for instance, I think in 2018, the then US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, had committed 130 million for projects related to connectivity, to infrastructure, digital connectivity, and so on in the Indo-Pacific. The thrust of the Trump administration was more on getting in private sector investment in Indo-Pacific countries, and to create an alternative narrative to that of China's. Obviously, China's model of state capitalism needed to be countered. That's what the US felt, and many other countries feel, that because there are totally different approaches, right? So that was one part of it. But again, the resources were not sufficient, and also there was no clarity. So for instance, on the one hand, you have, if you look at the Quad, so the US, Japan, and Australia, they have been working closely, and last year, or 2019 actually, they had unveiled what is called, the Blue Dot Initiative. Later on, India has also said that, to be part of it. But in terms of resources, in terms of the vision, there was a lack of clarity. And I think one of the major problems was that these projects, under the Indo-Pacific, you can only be so inclusive. Now, once you have all G7 countries coming on board, though I would add here that a number of other members of the G7 have also unveiled their own strategies of the Indo-Pacific. So there is an overlap there, but still, this is the scale is much more ambitious. Earlier, what was happening earlier was either something was done purely under the ambit of the Indo-Pacific or within the Quad. Then you break it down further. Japan and India are doing things. India, Japan, Australia are doing things. I think you need that as well. Obviously, things need to be, there are various layers to it. Connectivity projects and initiatives are not simple, but you need to send out this message collectively. So in that sense, it is important. The other important part is that the Belt and Road Initiative has drawn a lot of criticism for lacking transparency and for projects not being economically sustainable and leading to what is called debt trap diplomacy. Whether it's Southeast Asia, you have cases in South Asia like Sri Lanka, even if you look at the China-Pakistan economic corridor, there are question marks about it. Then in Africa, you have numerous cases of debt trap, though some Western scholars are skeptical about the debt trap. China, in certain cases, has also renegotiated projects. So in Myanmar, that has happened. But the debt trap diplomacy has opened up opportunities for other countries in terms of providing an alternative vision for connectivity. Right? It doesn't have, obviously, the approach will be different, not going to be similar to that of China, and nor are there those many resources at the disposal. So that's the debt trap is one part of it. And to focus on transparency, to focus even on the environment, because a number of the BRI-related projects will have also been questioned because of have faced opposition because of environmental concerns. This has happened in Myanmar and many other countries also. There's cases there. But the question has always been that it's fine to criticize the Belt and Road Initiative. What do you have as an alternative? Yeah. So the B3W is as we said earlier, it's a beginning. It's a step in that direction. Also, the B3W it dovetails well with some of Joe Biden's domestic initiatives with regard to the infrastructure, with regards to the economy. So there is space for that. So, and also to get along, I think to get the approval of other G7 countries, I think it's an important step. Now the problems are going to be, the first thing is that one, repeatedly, where are the resources going to come from? Because there is clearly, there is a need. I mean, in developing countries, there's a massive gap in terms of infrastructure which we fulfill, but will the G7 be able to do it? That's the first thing. And the second part, that as yet, this is just a broad vision. You've spoken about what is lacking in the Belt and Road Initiative, but you've not really put forward what are going to be the components. Are you going to be linking it up mostly to already existing Indo-Pacific initiatives? Are you going to be coming up with something fresh? Now, one positive is that recently there was a meeting of the consultative group of the Blue Dot initiative in Paris. So you had a number of stakeholders over there, apart from officials from the countries which are part of the Blue Dot. You also had entrepreneurs, you had members of civil society, you had some researchers and all that. But it's still not clear as to how how will the B3W link up with existing initiatives. So that's something which needs to be looked at. The other point is that even though the B3W so far, I mean the G7 and even the US has said that B3W is not only about targeting China. So I think that approach is correct. And even though it may be an alternative to BRI, but the US has said that it's not only about targeting China, we want to create something. So this is a difference in attitude from the Trump administration, which categorically said that, we want to counter the BRI and things like that. So that provides space. But there's also going to be an issue because some of the G7 members, they may have committed right now, but they would not want to annoy or offend China. So that's going to be one of the major problems.
So, well, yes, in time to come, we will know what will be the real opportunities that B3W will offer. Thanks a lot for joining us, and we hope that the discussion was really helpful for all our viewers. And keep watching us on Oneindia English.